All right, so here we are. I am joined by Mike Santos, a longtime NHL executive and a returning guest. Mike has come on the podcast before. He was on my 374th episode in May of 2025. Here he is joining me for my 400th episode. It truly is an honor, Mike, to not only have you back as a guest, but have you as a guest for a special episode of being number 400. How you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing great, Joey. It's fantastic to be here, especially with your 400th episode. Congratulations. That's an amazing accomplishment.
Thank you so much, truly. And it's great having you back on to talk more about what it's like being an NHL executive. You were the assistant GM and the director of hockey operations for some big franchises, the Nashville Predators, the Florida Panthers, and New York Islanders. So it'd be great to hear more of your insight of what it's like being in the backgrounds and, making some big time trades, moves, drafting players. It's going to be great to hear more about that today. So thank you, Mike, for your time. We'll start out with the NHL draft, because I think that's something that no one really talks about, and that's something that I would love to hear more about what it's like in the background of it. So, what's the interview process like when you're interviewing players? Because I know a lot of the time when you're watching a player, they look great on the ice. When you interview them, they might not have the answers you're looking for. They might not have the exact molds of a player you want in your locker room that may potentially happen. So, what's the interview process like when you're talking with prospects?
I'm sure it's different for different clubs and different folks that work for different clubs. For me, it was always sort of the culmination of everything that you've done to prepare for the draft and watching particular players. Um, I didn't want to put too much or too little weight on an interview, especially a final interview. I would rely heavily on our scouting staff, not only to watch players and see the way they perform, understand the things that the player may be good at, maybe needs some improvement at, maybe will be able to improve on a certain item or not improve on this item, but also to get a feeling for the player off the ice, to understand the person a little bit better. Whether that was spending a little extra time at the rink after the game to try to catch the player for a minute or two and just talk to them and get to know them. Maybe, you know, see their parents in the crowd and have a chance to go over and introduce yourself and get to know what type of family the player comes from. So a lot of that information, I would rely on my scouts in the organization to get so that we didn't put too much emphasis on one interview uh, just before the entry draft.
Mhm.
Typically, teams will interview players at the combine, which is in the early spring, and and then again they'll have last minute interviews with players. Oftentimes, there's second interviews at the draft itself, the day or two before the draft. So again, I don't want to put first of all, I don't want to wait until the day before the draft to
Mhm.
start to figure out if I believe in this particular young man's character or not, or to know or understand the person's background. Um, so I liked all that stuff to be upfront. That being said, I don't recall any interviews where it stopped our club from drafting a player. But it's certainly, particularly that last interview, could be the determining factor as to whether you took one player or another player at the position that you were drafting.
Mhm.
So, unless you're drafting number one overall,
Mhm.
you really don't know who you're picking. So even if you're at number two,
Mhm.
you've got to at least be considering two guys before you step to the podium and make that selection,
Mhm.
because you never know what the club in front of you is going to do.
Mhm.
Uh, there are years where, you know, there's a consensus number one overall pick, and typically that player goes number one. I can remember in 2013, Nathan McKinnon was the consensus number one. And there were some good players after him, Seth Jones and Alex Barkov, just to name a couple. You know, it was pretty known that Colorado was not going to move that first pick.
Hmm.
Uh, but you never know, right? I mean, there's always a chance. There's always somebody lurking in the background with a trade offer that can't be refused. And then all of a sudden, McKinnon's available when you're picking at number two or three or whatever it happens to be. So you've got to always be prepared, I would say, at the very least, with two different scenarios. And
Hmm.
as you move down in the draft order, and in particular, we're talking about the first round,
Hmm.
uh, the possibilities grow,
Hmm.
right? Especially when you start drafting 4, 6, 10, 15, 20, late 20s. Those are very good players. And not only, players being selected before you have a chance to pick, um, but you're going to be looking at a couple or several possibilities and have to make a decision between them. You certainly have a list and you've put together a priority, but some of these players, particularly when you're drafting an 18-year-old, are very close,
Hmm.
and you've got to make a decision on maybe some margins that are razor thin. So in that case, that last interview before the draft, or even the last two, the one at the combine and then at the draft,
Hmm.
are uh, are important.
Hmm. Yeah, very important game plan ahead, like you said, because you never know what the teams in front of you are going to do, or the teams even that are, the eighth pick, the 10th pick that could trade up and, jump and then, take a guy that you might want at, let's say, number three. They might trade up and get him at number two, right? That always can happen. But what's it like trying to equate a player's talent in their production from one league versus another? So let's say you have a top prospect that played in the USHL versus a top prospect that played in the OHL or another, league in Europe, let's say, for example. How difficult is that? Because obviously there's a lot of different competition, in the United States, in Canada, a lot of the European leagues. How difficult is it to try to say, okay, the one player had this production here, and another player had this production here? How difficult is that trying to, weigh those two options and, their stats in each place?
That's a real skill, and I'm not so sure that anyone, even those who have been watching these players in this game for years and years and years, have mastered.
Mhm.
It's difficult, right? It's very difficult, and frankly, it's something that my company, formerly Team 33, but now the Hockey Intelligence Agency, has really spent a lot of time in doing with our algorithms and our information so that we can compare apples to apples, so to speak, as opposed to trying to guess as to how a player in a certain league would succeed against a player in another league when they get into the National Hockey League.
Mhm.
So it's difficult. Why is it difficult? Well, you've got different levels of play, different age groups of players. You can have 17-year-olds who are playing in professional leagues in Europe,
Mhm.
uh, or you can have 17-year-olds or 18-year-olds who are playing collegiate hockey
Mhm.
or major junior hockey, including I'll include the USHL in this country at that level.
Mhm.
Uh, or you could be having players that are playing at prep school level.
Mhm.
There's such a variation of levels that it's a real tough thing to do.
Mhm.
What NHL clubs have traditionally done with their scouting is they do these things called crossing over.
Mhm.
So you may have a scout, for instance, that is in the New England area who concentrates primarily on prep school, high school, college hockey players, maybe some Quebec League players. And
Mhm.
at some point in the season, you may send that scout to Minnesota or to Western Canada and watch players in that league so that they have a perspective as to what they're watching on a regular basis compared to what they're not seeing on a regular basis, and they try to make that judgment a little bit easier on the scouts.
Mhm.
uh, so that's one thing they do. The second thing is that it really comes down to teamwork with your scouting staff, and the longer you can keep your scouting staff together, the more they understand one another.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, everybody has tendencies. You have tendency as players. Well, we have tendencies as scouts, right? I mean, some scouts like guys that are a little more physical. Other guys like guys that are highly skilled. It's not that any of them wouldn't like all of those things in a package, but it's just natural, right? We all like different things, right? You might like your hot dog with mustard, and I might like mine with relish, right? It's the same thing. So when you've got a cohesive staff where the staff members cross over, they spend time with guys in other areas that see other games, and that includes sending guys from North America to Europe and vice versa, bringing European guys here, scouts I'm talking about,
Hmm.
to watch players here. That gives them not only an understanding of the different levels, but it also gives them an understanding of each other,
Hmm.
um, when they can spend time together. But there's no perfect science to it.
Hmm.
We're I say we, but it's a was for me. But scouting staffs are looking at, for NHL teams anyway, they're really looking at 16, 17, and early 18-year-old, I'll call them boys,
Hmm.
and trying to predict what they're going to be as 22, 23, 24-year-old men.
Hmm.
And so it's an imperfect science. It's very difficult. Um, Look no further this season than a player, Gavin McKenna, who
Hmm.
was lighting the world on fire in the Western Hockey League, thought to be as tough a junior league as there is in the world, to be successful in. And then he comes to Penn State with all sorts of accolades and a big NIL contract this year, and he's not lighting the world on fire. He's playing well, but a lot of teams are starting to, change their mind as to whether he really should be the number one pick overall.
Hmm.
Uh, so, now he's playing with, but also playing against some players in that league that are probably 24, even turned 25 years old. I mean, he's 7 years, or even 7.5 years older than he is.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of things that are just different from level to level, and it's really hard to settle. It really is an imperfect science.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's something I'm excited to see with Hockey Intelligence Agency, which I know we talked about when it was Team 33 on the podcast originally, but it's your software and app that's coming out at some point where players and every single, essentially roster, and then, the players that they drafted as well, that, they hold the rights to, that are playing either in, Europe or, even in college. They're going to all be on the app, and then there's basically a rating system, and people can play as GM of their team and make trades and try to compare apples to apples, like you just said, pretending to be their own GM. So it's going to be
Yeah,
really cool when that does come out.
let's since we're in the season, let's draw an analogy to the college football playoff system,
Hmm.
right? And I mean, I've been, probably like you, looking at this for years, and without question, although the media, and I know why, and some other folks would never admit to this, but there's a bias towards and in favor of the SEC.
Hmm.
And every year, people just have this idea now that the SEC is just better than everybody else.
Hmm.
And I just don't believe it.
Hmm.
Uh, all leagues have good years and bad years, just like teams can have good years and bad years. And whether it was a couple of years ago, Florida State, who, as you know, as a Boston College fan, I have no love for,
Hmm.
but they were undefeated, and they found a way to tell them you're not going to go in the playoff because your quarterbacks are hurt, and so you won't be competitive anymore. Like,
Hmm.
they just went 13-0, right?
Hmm.
And I always see these things where, like this year, for instance, everybody was talking about the ACC and how it was down, it was terrible. And so, they didn't really even deserve to have a team, and they're lucky they got one team, and Duke was in the championship game. But I looked at the head-to-head competition between the SEC and the ACC, and I think it was 4-6. The ACC was, and I saw what wasn't a very good FSU team beat the heck out of Alabama, not just beat them, beat the heck out of them the same weekend that
Hmm.
Miami beat Notre Dame, and yet everybody wanted to talk about how Notre Dame can't get in because head to head, but nobody even wanted to talk about the fact that Alabama got their butt kicked by
Mhm.
FSU. So, I mean, you've got to remove bias from anything that involves judgment, and that's to transition back to the hockey world. That's what we try to do, is at least remove as much bias as you can from the process.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know that you can remove all of it, but that's the first step to being able to compare players at different levels and from different leagues or even different, parts of the world. Uh,
Mhm.
try to make a choice as to who's going to be more successful when they become pros.
For sure. I think also part of it is the eye test as well, right? Where you might see something based on stats and, one player might be better in one certain metric or, some sort of, stat, but then you might look at it in a different way. You say, okay, when I'm watching them play, they stand out a little bit more and something might not always show up on the stat sheet, right? Even when you look at, to relate it back now to the college football playoff, I think Notre Dame was better than Alabama. Like when you're just watching the two teams play, I think Notre Dame's a better team. Probably thought they should have got in, but I do think you're right. I think it's a valid statement that there is definitely a bias in some sort of the committee and how they rank teams. And just like you said, when you're trying to be somebody that's going to be working with HIA, let's say me, once I get the app, you want to try to remove some of the bias and try to look at players apple to apples, like you said, try to compare them. So that's why it's going to be a really cool app and software. And I'd love to hear an update on it. I know you've been working a lot on it the last year and a half now. And I know you said you'll be getting towards like the later stages of it, at some point soon. But do you have any updates on, where it stands today?
Well, in the past year, we've made a transition from a B2B to a B2C product. So it will be a consumer product. We're currently having discussions with the NHL Alumni Association, because this really seems to be a fit for what their goals are, not only finding ways to employ former players,
Hmm.
but also maybe raise revenue for alumni in the future. So we're working hard on a partnership with them first. From there, we'll talk to, hopefully the NHLPA and the NHL. But either way, we're still on target to launch before next hockey season. At that point, it would be a consumer product, a web-based platform that you could access either with your laptop or iPad or even your phone, as an app, and use it for whatever you want, whether that's just because you're crazy about your team or you've got a fantasy team you play, or you want to know what the chances are that this player is going to score against this team tonight, or whatever it happens to be. So we're moving along, but
Yeah.
the bias is a big issue in business. It's definitely a big issue in sports, and it's a big issue that you have to deal with scouting.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think even for me, like I watch a lot of college hockey, and most of it is the Hockey East, just because BC's right down the street, Northeast and BU. So I'll see a lot of those games in person, and then also see them on TV. So I know when I'm watching prospects and I'm watching games, I'm not gonna lie, there's a bias on my end to a lot of Hockey East guys, just because I've seen them play a lot more than I've seen guys that play in, the Big Ten, for example. But I think you're right. I think you kind of have to look at it even keeled, especially when you're a big time executive, right? When you're making a big decision on, two certain players that you're trying to weigh. Who should I take at number two? Should be this guy or that guy? You got to take all the bias away and say who's going to be give us the best chance to win, regardless of, how you might feel versus, the GM versus the owner. I'm sure there's a lot that kind of weighs into how to decide who takes, who you're going to take at number two or number three, for example. But I'd love to hear more about that when you're making a big time selection. The GM might have ultimately the biggest say, but does the owner ever have some sort of say in some of those situations and in your experience and what you've heard?
Um, the owner definitely has input, and you must, as any type of person in an executive role, keep your owner informed. I
Hmm.
mean, ultimately, it's your owner's money that you're playing with in these types of things, and so it's important that they be informed. There are situations where owners get involved. I've never been in a situation where an owner um, told our club, who we had to pick.
Hmm.
I have been told stories of other clubs where that's happened from time to time.
Hmm.
Um, but I also think that's just my opinion as to what makes a good owner. and that's somebody who puts people in place that he believes in, makes them accountable, and lets them do their jobs.
Mhm.
But the owner, even when it comes to drafting, typically they'd have little knowledge about these players, and they've got to trust the people they have in place. But
Mhm.
as uh, but as somebody that's in, whether it's a managerial role or as in a scouting role, I mean, you've got to keep your owner informed as to, why you're making this decision, why you're taking this player, and they'll have questions for you, as they should.
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? You have to kind of keep the people at the top informed. Like you said, it's their money at the end of the day. It's their team, they own it. So it makes sense to obviously keep communication, throughout the organization. When you're looking at making a trade, though, for example, and this is something we talked about before we, started this episode, I'd love to hear more about what it's like behind the scenes when you're making a trade, whether that's an owner, you have to keep them involved if you're trading a star player, for example, or what it's like talking to certain scouts that say, I might not want to trade this prospect because X, Y, and Z. What's it like behind the scenes when you're really building a trade package?
Trades typically take a lot longer to consummate than maybe the average fan understands. First of all, with any trade involving players, you're really upsetting their lives.
Mhm.
Now they get paid handsomely. They understand this is part of the job.
Mhm.
Um, but it still doesn't make it any easier, right? I mean, some of them have wives or families, maybe even they're from a certain area that's close to where the team is they play for.
Mhm.
They've been playing there for a long time, and they've, got roots in that community. So it's not just the fact that you're trading them to a new team, it's a fact that you're really uprooting their lives. That's the first thing that I think is always tough. Um, and for that reason, I always feel or felt that it was important to be straight up and honest with them. And even answering their questions as to, why did you trade me?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but as far as how trades come about, typically they can come about for a number of reasons. Okay. I've been in situations where ownership has come and said, you got to cut the payroll.
Mhm.
Maybe you're over budget, or maybe ownership just doesn't believe that attendance is good enough, and or the team is good enough to go far this year, and so they want to cut their losses, and they'll tell you you've got to cut the payroll, and they'll. I've been in meetings where owners have said you've got to cut the payroll, and they won't tell me what to do. They'll
Mhm.
just tell me I got to cut the payroll, and I've got to figure out with the staff, how are we going to get to where we can be competitive, or we can continue on with the plan we have, and appease the owner with their issues regarding the payroll. There'll be other situations where an owner may tell you to cut the payroll and want a specific player move to cut that payroll. Maybe it's because it's a particular contract that that owner doesn't want to have to pay for however many years that they're still remaining. Um, there may be situations where you've got to make moves in other areas, and so you've got to do some things that'll give you room under the salary cap to do that.
Mhm.
And then there's probably the type of trade that's we're seeing less and less of in all sports, but particularly hockey now, and that's just the straight hockey trade
Mhm.
where teams are trying to improve themselves.
Mhm.
And everything now is geared around the salary cap and deferred compensation and all sorts of other types of things, and buying out players, and all that sort of long-term injury that we can talk about in a minute if you want.
Mhm.
So the real straight up, I'll call them bubblegum card hockey trades, they're just not as common as they used to be.
Mhm.
Um, but those are obviously, if you're in that position, that's the most fun to be in. I mean, that's what's really fun about the job and challenging about the job, and probably the reason why a lot of people get into those jobs is because that's what they really want to do.
Hmm.
But you don't do it as often as maybe you would hope or think or like. Then you've got all other types of situations. I've had players who quietly would come to me and maybe there's a family situation, an illness or something,
Hmm.
and you make a trade that you really don't want to make, but it's in their best interest. They need to be home, closer to a sick family member or whatever it happens to be. Uh,
Hmm.
Sometimes you make those trades and the public doesn't really know what the reason is behind them, and you take a little bit of the heat for it. But you've gotta be a human being in this business as well, and understand those types of things, and treat people with some kindness once in a while, and help them as human beings.
Hmm.
Uh, Not always the easiest thing to do.
Hmm.
Uh, and then there's situations where players, have received more and more leverage over the years, um, and and agents have learned how to create more and more leverage or use leverage. So there's situations where that a player is just not going to re-sign with you,
Hmm.
doesn't want to be there. Maybe it's because your geographical location, or maybe he wants to play in a place where he can save on income taxes, or
Hmm.
the big one obviously is wants a better chance to win. And those situations where your hands forced a little bit, you've got to, and seems to be the reason why the Quinn Hughes deal was made yesterday. Was the I haven't looked a lot into it, but apparently Vancouver was like, we're not going to be able to keep this guy.
Hmm.
And a lot of people for a while thought that it was inevitable he was eventually going to end up in New Jersey with his two brothers. So I think that's what was surprising about the deal to Minnesota.
Hmm.
Uh, I know Billy Guerin, he's a former Eagle,
Hmm.
like the two of us. I'm sure he would have done his homework, making sure that if he was going to make that type of move, that there was a chance he was going to keep them there for the long term.
Hmm.
But yeah, there's all sorts of reasons for trades. And then how they start is it's typically one team who has a reason to make a trade, simply reaching out to another team, whether they hear through the grapevine that a player or a certain player might be available, or it's just they're trying to create a situation because they're looking at the other team's salary cap numbers or their payroll or their place in the standing, or maybe, I mean, everybody sort of knows everybody else's depth chart, what they need,
Hmm.
and see if there's a fit to, make a trade that will help both clubs. I think it's I think it's a mistake, and I think it's very rare that teams try to make trades and win trades.
Hmm.
There's this theory out there that everybody's trying to win a trade. Whenever there's a trade made, the media seem to have this reporting that tells you like, well, this team won the trade, because they got this and they only gave up that.
Hmm.
Um, I don't, I don't think that's the right way to look at trades when you're in management.
Hmm.
I also, I also don't think most teams do that, and certainly that's not the way trades are happen most of the time. I think teams are truly trying to find a trade that's fair, and it will help both teams. Whether that's swapping a player of one position for a player of another position, or whatever it happens to be.
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into making those moves, right? And I think what you said best was it is a business at the end of the day. The players know it's, part of the job. And just like when you're at the top, right, as an assistant GM, there's a responsibility to obviously improve the roster, right? So there's going to be difficult decisions to make. One thing you did mention is a lot of the time now players are getting more and more leverage and agents are finding ways to get them more leverage. What's it like in an arbitration case, right? Where a player is, under arbitration, whatever it may be, and you're trying to find a way to, come together and find a number that actually works to keep them. Let's say if they're like a restricted free agent, for example.
Um, People have different philosophies about arbitration. I know if you talk to many executives, in the NHL with NHL teams, they will tell you they don't like arbitration because they've got to go into uh, a hearing and say negative things about a player.
Hmm.
And no matter what happens in our arbitration, now they've driven a wedge between the player and the team, and the player's upset, and they don't have that strong relationship with the player anymore.
Hmm.
That's what you'll hear a lot from the NHL side. I think the NHLPA over the years has learned that that gives them some leverage, and they'll file for arbitration with the belief that the team will eventually settle
Hmm.
before they get to a hearing,
Hmm.
and they'll settle at a number that's probably closer to what the player is asking for than, and maybe not in, and maybe doesn't even deserve,
Hmm.
just to avoid that confrontation.
Hmm.
My belief in arbitration was completely opposite of that.
Hmm.
I always felt that we had done the negotiating up to that point and we were unable to get a deal for whatever reason.
Hmm.
And so I looked at arbitration as a way that I was going to get that player signed.
Hmm.
Maybe it was going to be a number closer to what that player wanted. Maybe it was a number closer to what the team wanted that I was working for. But the comfortability for me was the player's going to get signed.
Hmm.
So I don't have to worry about a holdout or anything else, trade me right now or anything like that.
Hmm.
Um, and then I always felt because in most situations it was the player that chose arbitration. It's the player's right to choose to go to arbitration. I always felt it was the player's agent and the player's association's responsibility to educate the player about the process and what it was all about.
Hmm.
And that we were not going to, we meaning the team, we're not going to go in there and throw rose petals at their feet and tell them how wonderful they are. That's just not what this process is about.
Hmm.
Um, Now, I would never do anything, and it wouldn't even be allowed anyway, that was personal
Hmm.
about the player. I mean, most everything is statistical, but you've got to go in there and point out the player's flaws, and you've got to fight for your employer, which is the team that you
Hmm.
work for.
Hmm.
And I always believe that if the player was informed of the process and what it was all about, that I never had any problem with the result.
Hmm.
Uh, I would say I was in many arbitration cases, um, and I would always let the agent know before the time came to file that if they filed for arbitration, that we were going to go to arbitration. And I had several situations with players where the agent would even, you know, grab me right before we went into the hearing
Hmm.
and say, "Hey, why don't we settle this for this much?" And my answer was always, "No, we've come this far.
Hmm.
My summer has been ruined with preparing for this arbitration for weeks and weeks and weeks, and so we're going to have an arbitration."
Hmm.
So I'm not sure whether the clubs do that or don't do that, but I know that most players who file for arbitration, I mean, more than the majority, I'd say the super majority of players that file for arbitration settle before before the hearing.
Hmm.
It's usually it's usually a number that a little more favorable to the player than the club. But
Hmm.
again, I always would let the agent know you have the right to file for arbitration. I don't hold any grudges for you.
Hmm.
Um, but know that, don't file thinking that we're going to settle. So if you file with me, we're going to have a hearing. Make sure your player knows what it's all about,
Hmm.
nothing personal, and we'll get the player signed.
Hmm. Definitely. And like you said, you spent all summer trying to prepare for all of those, situations where you're trying to find a number that you can meet on. And then once the arbitration happens, when you're walking in the room and they try to throw a number at you, obviously they didn't understand that, you were being truthful and honest, saying, hey, like once you say we're going to go to arbitration, we're going there. So, you're not going to find me, outside in the hallway and find a number. But I'm sure there's a lot of pressure on you, right? As an assistant GM, trying to get those situations over with, right? Because you're preparing for the next season, right? So you're really trying to obviously get the guy signed and have your roster ready. You're also looking for the future. the being an assistant GM, it's a full-time job, right? You're planning for the now, the short-term future, the long-term future. It's a long process. It's a long job. It's not an easy job at all by any means. What's it like? Like you just said, over the summer, you're preparing for a lot of those types of arbitration meetings. How how difficult is it to have a work-life balance when you're, that high up as an assistant GM? There's a lot of pressure on you, obviously, and it's a 365-day job. What's the work-life balance like, if there's any?
Um, there's certainly it's not good. There's no doubt about that. But I can only speak for myself. I mean, I always worked off of, 1 year plans, 3 year plans, 5 year plans.
Hmm.
So I always was looking, 1, 3, 5 years out as to, how our team roster was going to change, right? I mean, some of it's predicting,
Hmm.
that this player will be developed well enough to move up from the American Hockey League, and this player is going to be too much money that we don't want to spend for that position, and so we'll move on to that player, or all those types of things. So you're always looking and understanding that the roster is going to turn over,
Hmm.
and so for me, when it came to roster management and negotiating contracts, it was a continuous thing. It wasn't the season's over and now we got to sign everybody for next year.
Hmm.
Um, and that includes from year to year, understanding what type of money based on your budget, not the cap, although most teams now just go right to the cap, but
Hmm.
it was always based on the budget. What type of money do we have to spend in the free agent pool, and what could we get that would help our team? Not necessarily chasing after the big name free agent, but you need a certain player that can do some certain things at a certain position. Like, what's the best we can get, for our money there? So it was a more of a planning situation. I say to people now because I still get calls from a lot of younger people and people that are in those positions now the 30 years that I was in those positions, there was an assistant GM.
Hmm.
And now I look at organizations and they have five assistant GMs.
Hmm.
So they, probably like a lot of businesses in the world, they have specialized different things, in that role.
Hmm.
And so one person probably handles contracts, and one person handles scouting, and another person handles, development and whatever. And so it's a little bit different, I would think, when it comes to work-life balance now, because there just wasn't, there weren't three or four other people like me to say like, oh, I'll be the guy that sets up training camp, or I'll be the guy that, organizes the scouts. I mean, it all fell on me when I was doing that job.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, I think the biggest thing about that position though for me was planning,
Hmm.
planning and preparation. And that and goes back to negotiation or salary arbitration. I mean, when a player would file for salary arbitration, I'd already been preparing for months.
Hmm.
My reasoning why I wanted to pay the player what I wanted to pay the player, and that's another thing that I think develops over year. You develop relationships with agents
Hmm.
and with players,
Hmm.
and it's important that you develop an honest relationship with them
Hmm.
so that they understand when you sit down and negotiate a contract, probably more so than anything else you do with players, that you're being honest, that
Hmm.
you're not coming in with some crazy number thinking like, okay, I'm going to offer them this much, but I'm really willing to go to that much. I was never that type of negotiator.
Hmm.
And over time and negotiating a lot of contracts with a lot of different agents for a lot of different players, people understood that I wasn't going to waste anyone's time. I wasn't going to come in there and try to lowball them with the idea that we're going to go, back and forth. I'll offer you 1 million, you'll ask for 5 million, then I'll offer two, and then you'll ask for four, and then somehow 3 months from now we'll settle at three. Like, that just wasn't my
Hmm.
style. My style was to do the preparation, to look at the comparable players and the salary information, and to present, what I thought was a fair offer with some support information that the agent and the player could look at.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I found that as I developed the relationships and the reputation among a lot of the agents, it made the process, a lot better.
Mhm. Definitely. And you kept a respectful, honestly, communication, right? You told them, you have the right to file for arbitration. And once you do that, we'll be going there. Like you said, you kept it honest and truthful. And I think that's really important, right? Is kind of that fluid communication between, you as the assistant GM and the player and the agent. I feel like that's something that from a fan's perspective, that's something we never really see what goes on, behind the scenes when you negotiate a contract, especially arbitration, or even like you said, making a trade and telling a player why they're getting traded, right? Those are things we never see from a fan's perspective. So I do appreciate you giving that insight. And one thing you did mention is managing a budget, right? And obviously that's part of it is negotiating contracts, free agents, making trades. There's money coming in, there's money going out. What are your thoughts on the NHL salary cap rising, and how do you think that's going to really impact the ability of teams to now start signing more long-term contracts? You've seen more recently over the last 5 years. I see a lot more 6-year deals, 8-year deals, even potential 10-year deals. Right? You'll see a lot more long-term contracts. How do you think that's going to really impact the way teams go out and sign contracts now?
So we're 20 plus years now into the salary cap world
Hmm.
in the NHL. And I remember when the salary cap was first um, created for the NHL, and Gary Bettman said something that I'll never forget. He said, these are our parameters. This is the lower limit. This is the upper limit. I don't even remember what it was back then. I want to say it was like
Yeah.
the lower limit was like 28 million, and the upper limit was like 44 million or something. I don't know.
Hmm.
You could look it up and find out what it was. But I remember Gary Bettman said, as much as everybody thought that this was a cap on salaries, that what was going to happen was all these teams were going to immediately use the upper limit as their budget, and that teams who, like for instance, when I was with the Islanders, we had payrolls in the teens, in the mid teens, and all of a sudden, a team like ours had to almost double its payroll
Hmm.
with the salary cap back then, just to get to the lower limit.
Hmm.
And he was right. It acted like a magnet, and teams, um, and I'll blame this on ultimately owners who want to win at all costs,
Hmm.
and secondly on the people they hire, whether it's general managers, assistant general managers, that don't want to necessarily act on in the owner's best interest, regardless of what the owner says the budget is or the cap is.
Hmm.
Um, and they don't try to get the best deal on behalf of their club. They just spend, 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 right? And and I always worked with teams where even if the budget was not set for me by the owner or the finance people or both, I always proposed a budget that was lower than the upper limit, somewhere usually just above the mid cap between the lower and upper limit, because I always felt I could get the same team signed by just working a little harder, creating fair deals, not being lazy with the owner's money, and more importantly, when we needed to add to the team, like at the trade deadline, or give us a little push to win at the end, we always had some room to add those players that many other teams couldn't because they were up against the cap.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think that's a big part of understanding the cap. Um, NHL teams, it's like a magnet. They just the cap goes up and they go right to the cap again. Um, Now, why is it risen the way it's risen? Because revenues for the NHL are fantastic. They're at an all-time high.
Hmm.
Uh, driven by television contracts and endorsements and corporate partnerships and everything else, right? International play. And so, it's at an all-time high. And the players are partners in that. It's
Hmm.
a 50-50 partnership. I mean, the way it works is, there's a cap on the amount of money that's going to be spent on NHL players in a particular year. and that's based on what the predictions are for overall revenue for the fall, for that season.
Hmm.
And you don't know what that number is going to be until the season's over and the year's over, and they go back and say, okay, this is how much money we really raised. Um,
Hmm.
and so, number one, that's why they have this escrow account that players pay into just in case the revenues don't meet
Hmm.
what they thought they were, right? And then the overall cap for what players can earn playing is based upon, you know, their share of 50% of the overall revenue.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
In the Players Association has a responsibility to create some revenue beyond the fact that like we're the popular guys that play the game and everybody likes us, right? Like I'm not so sure that the Players Association has got to the point yet where they're able to drive revenue like the NHL does. I mean, hopefully they will. That's only going to help everybody.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
right now they share in 50% of that pot, and that's how the cap comes about. That's how it's that's why the reason for revenue.
Hmm.
Uh, sorry, for escrow,
Hmm.
and things are good revenue wise right now. That could change, but there's no sign of it right now. Everything's gone really well business wise for hockey.
Yeah, and it's encouraging, right? That's what you want to see. You want to see the game grow. And like you said, the television contracts, the streaming deals, now in each league, every league basically has a streaming deal, of some sort. The merchandise deals, the sponsorships. You pointed out a lot of great things there that, is obviously a good thing. Business is booming right now for the NHL. And, that's the way it should be. It's great that, the game's really growing. I think international play, like you said, is big time with the Olympics coming up, the Winter Olympics. That's something that always grows the game, just like with the World Cup coming, very soon as well. When you have those big tournaments, country versus country, that does grow the game. It grows interest in those professional leagues. That's why the MLS grew, over the last 10 years. That's why you see the NHL growing more and more as well. Baseball did very well with the World Baseball Classic a few years ago. Coming down to Shohei Ohtani and Mike Trout, teammates, people really bought into that tournament, and then people start watching more baseball in the MLB. Like, I feel like that's a great thing that the NHL and all the other leagues have done is really advertising those big tournaments and more over the last few years, right? With the way the NHL did, the All-Star game last year, really flipping it from what it used to be into something that was really special and different. You know what I mean?
And don't forget probably the greatest impetus for all of that growth, and that's expansion.
Hmm. Hmm.
You're hearing incredible numbers for like the NHL's next expansion, and it will happen. I mean, I can remember when the league was 14 teams.
Hmm.
When I first got involved, actually working in the league, it was 21 teams.
Hmm.
So, we're up to 32 and counting.
Hmm.
Uh, so it's really, when you hear some of the prices for an expansion club, that's and the fact that the league's going to be in more markets,
Hmm.
going to create more interest in more areas, more merchandise, more jobs for players,
Hmm.
um, you know, more TV revenue.
Hmm.
It's, I mean, that's probably the biggest impetus for expansion. And a lot of that too, I don't think a lot of people give enough credit to the owners and even the president at the time. They didn't call him a commission, but the president at the time, which was John Ziegler,
Hmm.
in the particularly in the late 80s and into the very early 90s. I mean, he and those owners back then are the ones that put together a plan for growth into non-traditional markets like Texas and Florida and California and Arizona. I mean, they're the ones that did all the research and all the work to set that expansion up.
Hmm.
It didn't just happen. I mean,
Hmm.
we're seeing it now. I mean, how great the game's become and how it's played everywhere. And even players, how they don't want to, I hate to say this, but they don't want to play in Buffalo and Detroit. Why would they when they can play in Las Vegas and Dallas and Miami, right? Like
Hmm.
um, all of that was the foresight of the team owners and John Ziegler, the president at the time, in the late '80s. Like that's why this has all been created now. Like this isn't something that's just grown out of how wonderful the sport's grown in the last 5 years or 10 years. This was really a plan that was put in place over 30 years ago.
hmm Yeah, look how much it's, worked obviously, and it's continuing to grow, which is awesome. You did mention obviously when you first stepped in the league there were 21 teams, and then now obviously it's grown. How difficult was it back then when, there's an expansion team coming and they can pick players off teams, right? So you can block off a certain amount of players that, are untouchable, for example, but there were some that were right on the border that you obviously wanted to keep that you couldn't. How difficult was that? What was that process like, saying these are the guys I want to keep for sure, and then everyone else could be potentially up for grabs?
Well, in my early years working in the league, the expansion rules were heavily favored towards the existing clubs.
hmm
So you could protect, pretty much anything that was, or anybody that was an asset to your club.
hmm
And expansion teams, and you can look back at the records of some of these teams from back in the day, whether it's, all the way back, even before my time to the '70s, like the Washington Capitals,
hmm
um, their first season, the Colorado Rockies, and then, even go to the San Jose Sharks, which I believe came in like '91, I think. I think the
hmm
Sharks came in 91. I mean, these teams, they had nothing,
hmm
and they were winning, no lie. I mean, 10 to 15 games a year. That
hmm
was it. I mean,
hmm
these teams were losing 60 plus games in their first seasons.
hmm
So the rules were heavily favored uh, for the existing clubs.
hmm
And then as expansion fees started to grow, the rules started to change a little bit, right?
hmm
Tampa and Ottawa came in. Still, the rules weren't great for them either, and you can look at their early records.
hmm
And then, from there, you had Florida came in, and the Ducks came in, and they were a little bit more competitive. And over time, the rules shifted because the money became big enough that, the fees to get in as an expansion club were now large enough that these people, owners, or owners that were coming into the league, were like, I'm not going to spend at the time 100 million, or now, or 600 million, or now $2 billion, and I'm going to have a cruddy team for the next decade.
hmm
So that started to change, um, probably about the time we got Columbus, Nashville, Minnesota Wild, those teams.
hmm
The rules then became a little bit more favorable to the expansion teams.
hmm
And for me, with the Islanders, and then again with the Predators, um, we had to again just be prepared and do a good job of evaluating our players. And again, I go back to what I talked about a few minutes ago, which is having a plan that was more than just what we're going to be like tomorrow.
hmm
I had to have a vision for 3 years from now, 5 years from now. You had to look at these players and say, okay, this player is great, but we can't afford this player in 4 years. So let's figure out if maybe that's the player we expose in the expansion draft, right? Or maybe we want to expose a defenseman instead of a forward, whatever it might be. It was really just about planning and preparation.
hmm
And a few teams along the way didn't do planning or preparation. I know I thankfully I was gone from the Florida Panthers, but when Vegas came in, they got Marchessault and somebody else. I forget who it was, but um, yeah, you've just got to be prepared. Your staff has to do a good job at evaluating what you have.
hmm
Uh, if you do that, then everything works out well.
hmm
Vegas, Vegas was really sharp. They had hired some good people from different organizations. They did a good job especially the year before, and picked apart some really good players, which allowed them to get to the finals in their first year.
Yeah, which isn't like the common expansion team, like you said, especially in years past when expansion teams first started, showing up and happening. But
When
obviously,
remember when Seattle came in, everybody thought, "Oh, wow, they're going to do the same thing." But I think the existing teams learned their lesson, right, and said, "Whoa, we're going to be prepared this time." So it wasn't so easy for Seattle to become as competitive or as good as Vegas so soon.
Yeah, people learned from that. That's a great point. And I loved hearing your strategy about what it's like, obviously protecting certain players or certain positions. If defensemen, that's an area of need. You want to make sure you protect those guys. And maybe vice versa. If you have a lot of forwards, and some of them you can get rid of, you don't protect some of those guys, whatever it may be. That's cool to hear a lot of that strategy. And obviously the game has grown. There's been a lot of changes, like we noted. There's some been rule changes as well. One thing I wanted to ask you about was the long-term IR rule and the changes there that just happened recently. This past fall. It was maybe in September when they adopted that new rule with the long-term IR. What were your thoughts on that, and what was it like when you were an assistant GM, kind of working through that of do we send a player to long-term IR? How does it work money-wise? What was kind of the backstory there when you were in the front office?
So, I mean, long-term injury reserve loophole, I'll call it. Um, it has been the thing of the last almost 10 years.
Hmm.
But before that, there's always been teams in particular, but with the help of agents and the Players Association
Hmm.
that take every collective bargaining agreement and immediately look for loopholes,
Hmm.
ways around things, because they want to get the teams, they want to get a competitive advantage.
Hmm.
The agents want, and the Players Association wants more money for their players. Um, I can remember going way back when Joe Thornton signed his first contract with the Boston Bruins, and there was a rookie salary cap, but there was a loophole that they found which allowed for the provision of 6 or 7 bonuses categories like goals in a season or points in a season or games played and all these types of things, whereby if Joe achieved 2 bonuses, he got paid for all 6 or 7 bonuses, like those types of things. So there's always people on both sides, including the team, people who are trying to get a competitive advantage, who are looking for loopholes in this
Hmm.
collective bargaining agreement instead of using the collective bargaining agreement the way it was negotiated.
Hmm.
So that's never going to go away. As far as long-term injury reserve loophole, I think the first time that really became exposed was Tampa Bay
Yep.
used it.
Stamkos. Yeah.
Yeah, and then other teams started to say, like, gee, look at the advantage of this. We've got to do it. And unfortunately, you're in a collective bargaining agreement.
Hmm.
So, you can't make a change midway without, the Players Association agreed to it. And why would the Players Association agree? It was favoring them. They were getting more money.
Hmm.
More guys were playing in the NHL.
Hmm.
Guys that were injured were still getting paid.
Hmm.
So it was creating more money for their constituents, so they wouldn't want to change it.
Hmm.
I think it's good that they're finally closing that loophole, so to speak.
Hmm.
Um, it's it is what it is. They'll find another one with the next CBA, I'm sure, or 2 or 3.
Hmm.
Uh, I never used it. I did have players that were placed on long-term injury reserve,
Hmm.
but they weren't done so that I could put them in the closet and then pull them out for the playoffs. I mean, you saw the Panthers did that last year with Kachuk, and they also took advantage of the suspension of Ekblad
Hmm.
in order to bring in a player like Seth Jones,
Hmm.
who otherwise there's no way they could have fit him
Hmm.
on their roster and under the salary cap.
Hmm.
Uh, but it's legal, and
Yeah.
so they use the rules, and and teams were upset about it, but they could have done the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what the Dodgers do in baseball, right? They spend so much money and they go to the
Sure.
luxury tax, but they avoid that obviously by deferrals and stuff like that. But people get upset with what they're doing, but there's no rules on how much money you can defer in baseball down the line. There's no rules on, how much money you can give, in a certain year versus others. That you can do it any way you need to in baseball, which is nice. I guess if you're a Dodgers fan, if you're a fan of, let's say, the Cincinnati Reds, for example, the Tampa Bay Rays, a lot of those teams have a disadvantage in some respect because their owners might not be as open to deferring as much money down the line like the Dodgers do, but there's no rules against that. Just like you said before, this new long-term IR rule, it was a loophole and there were no rules against it, so you really can't blame or fault the Panthers. There were going to be other teams that are going to be upset with it that may not have that same ability, or I guess in hockey in some regard every team could have done that, but not every team in the position that the Panthers were in where they could say, let's just stash these guys away. Then when we get to the playoffs, we'll be, ready to go and potentially win again, which they already did, winning 2 years in a row. So there is a competitive advantage, but like you said, there weren't necessarily rules against it. So what do you think about in the game of baseball, though? Do you think there should be limits on deferrals and how much money you can, push down the line in future years?
Yeah, I look, when I first went to the New York Islanders, it was post dynasty days.
Hmm.
So, I went to work. I mean, think about it, the Islanders won four cups in a row from 80 to 83,
Hmm.
and then lost in the finals in 84 to Edmonton.
Hmm.
I went to work for the Islanders in 97,
Hmm.
and we were still paying. Certainly, the numbers were much smaller back then, but at the time, they didn't seem small.
Hmm.
We were paying deferred compensation for a number of players in 1997 that hadn't played for years, and certainly hadn't played for the Islanders for years.
Hmm.
So I'm not a big fan of that. Um, I don't pretend to understand or know the financials of baseball.
Hmm.
Uh, so, but the optics to me aren't good.
Hmm.
When you do a contract like they did last year for Shohei Ohtani, for instance, right? I mean, it's just it's just I guess it's within the rules of their collective bargaining agreement. Or they wouldn't do it.
Hmm.
Uh, Major League Baseball wouldn't allow them to do it.
Hmm.
But ultimately, to think that 30 years from now, there's going to be a team, the Dodgers, and whoever's working for the Dodgers in those days that are still going to be paying these players. And based on this type of idea that things are always going to continue to go up, 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 up. I mean, we know that
Hmm.
as human beings, right? I mean, anybody that's purchased a home in their lifetime, purchases it, and all of a sudden the bubble bursts and the value of their home goes from what they paid to it to half of what they paid to it, and then takes years and years and years to get back up there. The markets in sports can work the same way.
Yeah.
So they're mortgaging they're mortgaging the future to win now.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah. And there's no
I,
rules against it, in baseball. Like you
oh,
said,
there's no
they're
rules
sending all
against
that
it.
money down the line. 680 million they're sending down the line for Shohei, which there's a luxury tax amount. So he's on the luxury tax, it's essentially like $47 million dollars a year is what he's getting, what the Dodgers are paying on that, what they're getting hit for, in their salary and their payroll. But in reality, they're a team that can basically print money, right? So they don't care about, being hit for X amount of money down the line. And, the value of money goes up probably, right, over time, or potentially, like you said, things can burst and go down, but they're going to be still spending and paying him money 30 years, 25, 30 years from now. They're going to be still giving a lot of these guys probably money, which is crazy. But when you first started in the NHL, was there a limit on how much money you could defer or a percentage of a contract that you could send down the line?
That's a good question. I honestly don't recall um, what the rules were for deferring
Mhm.
payments, but that all went away with
Mhm.
the first collective bargaining agreement that had a salary cap, and you weren't allowed to defer payments.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know the financials of baseball. I don't think it's good.
Mhm.
It's certainly not good from a competitive standpoint
Mhm.
to allow teams to do that, especially. whether they have the resources or not.
Hmm.
We've we've talked about in sports, competitive balance and doing things so that it was fair and scheduling so it's fair and everything's for fairness. And I mean, hockey, we standardized the size of the rinks. It used to be, you could play in Boston Garden and it was smaller than the Montreal Forum, right? The team benches were on the same side. The penalty box was, the penalty box used to be next to the home team bench. So that was an advantage, and they took all of that away
Hmm.
so that it would be there'd be no competitive advantage to one time to another. We kept talking about parity, 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 and then so when you see something like this happen in baseball, it can't be good for the game. I'm sure there were a lot of people rooting against the Dodgers this year
Hmm.
that weren't from LA, but
Hmm.
it's hard to change these things because these sports or these businesses of sport, they operate under collective bargaining agreements, and so
Hmm.
it's going to be pretty hard to convince a players association to change the rules when their side's benefiting with by all this money going their way.
Hmm. For sure. You're right. The CBA is kind of what it all comes down to. And with what the Dodgers are doing, it's all legal, sending money down the line like they have. And they'll be paying Shohei, if I remember correctly, to like 2047. Like he's getting most of his money between 2038 and 2047. So they're giving him, I think it's like 60 million, whatever it is per year, or 68 million per year over that 10-year window, which is crazy. And the MLB is probably going to be
Also,
having.
he'll also, I'm sure, by that time, have himself a nice home somewhere in a non-income tax state where he doesn't have to pay income taxes on all that money either, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So he's going to save that way. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to him in this whole thing, and to anybody else if they sign that way.
Hmm.
But yeah, I don't see how it's going to be good for baseball or anything else. But they don't have a cap.
Hmm.
They don't have a salary cap, and the institution of a salary cap at least begins the process of getting those types of things in order.
Hmm.
But if you're going to have a salary cap and it's going to be a hard cap, you can't allow for deferred compensation.
Hmm. Yeah, no, you're right. That was a smart thing the NHL did. And I think with baseball, I think a salary cap with the next CBA, I'd say it's probably unlikely. I think a salary floor would be nice. I think that's a start. Just have every team kind of spend like, the NHL does. You have that lower level, thing that you kind of have to, everyone spends. And the NBA has that as well, like a certain amount of money every single team has to spend, a salary floor, right? With the NHL though, and I think the MLB is working its way towards a lockout in the next CBA. You were in the NHL when there was the lockout back in, was it 2012? 2012.
I worked through three work stoppages in the NHL. Yeah.
And what was that like? If you want to talk about, if you could talk about one of them, and I don't want to hold you for too long, so I'll make this the last question. But what was that like working through those?
Well, I worked through one. The years get mixed up because I'm getting old, Joey. But I worked through one where the entire season was canceled.
Hmm.
That was back in the early 2000s. I mean, that wasn't fun.
Hmm.
Uh, and in all three that work stoppages that I was a part of, and actually there was a fourth. There was a strike back in the late 90s, or maybe it was even mid 90s,
Hmm.
right? I think
Yeah,
90.
you're right. You got it. 92, there was a strike. I just looked it
Uh,
up. 30-game strike in 1992.
I was working for the league office at that time, and the strike happened during the season. The players went on a strike right before the playoffs, like about a month before the playoffs. Um, they ended up not doing real well with that strike. But anyway, in every situation that I was involved in, like me in particular, I had to take a pay cut.
Hmm.
Um, and the players themselves obviously weren't paid in those times, but it's always been a union position with players that, whether it's a strike or a lockout, before we agree to a new collective bargaining agreement or before we agree to go back and play, we're going to get your pay retroactive
Hmm.
uh, for employees like me, there was no retroactive pay. That I missed my pay. I missed my pay.
Hmm.
So what was it like? It was awful. It was terrible.
Hmm.
Uh, it also, you know, it really, and the league did some things to try to pick the momentum back up, but it really killed the momentum
Hmm.
for coming out of those types of work stoppages. It took a while.
Hmm.
Uh, so I mean, in 2012, it really ripped my team, the Florida Panthers at the time, apart
Hmm.
because we were a team that had finally made the playoffs for the first time in 12 or 13 years. Um, there was a good plan in place with some veteran players who were brought in there. We had reduced our payroll, brought in 13 or 14 free agent players, veteran guys, Ed Jovanovski, Brian Campbell, Christopher Stieg, Marcel Gotch. I mean, the names keep coming. Scotty Upshall. Anyway, we not only made the playoffs, but we won our division for the first time ever. Uh, we lost in, I think it was triple overtime in New Jersey in the playoffs, who went to the finals.
Hmm.
So we were in a good spot, and we were also developing a deep pool of prospects that we had drafted.
Hmm.
And then this thing came, and it really screwed up everything. And so, particularly with some of those older players that we had that we lost them because they were gone after the year, or
Hmm.
they were just another year older. Uh, and it forced us to maybe bring up some younger players sooner than we would have liked. So in that particular situation, it really hurt our organization. Um,
Hmm.
we came back, I want to say in January and February, and played not even a half a season of
Hmm.
total games we played,
Hmm.
but it was less than 40, I believe.
Hmm.
And yeah, and then the next season didn't recover either. In the 13-14 season, we bumbled along, and it really, I mean, it really hurt us for a couple of years till we were able to get things back together.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it can kill momentum from the team's perspective. Like, obviously, you guys had a great free agency class, and you didn't really get to, live out most of those contracts, and didn't get as much value with a lot of guys just being gone after that and being a year older, like you said. But I think it also kills the league's momentum as well to some degree, right? Like
Yeah,
baseball in a couple of years. When they have their probably, which will be a lockout. I mean, you never know, but it probably will be a lockout when they do the next CBA. That's going to kill, I think, momentum of the league as well, because who knows how long it'll be. It could ruin a whole season, like you said, right? In 2004, 2005, that canceled the entire season, right? So, and in baseball's perspective, you cancel a whole season. I mean, you're going to lose some interest, I think, and maybe it'll help the game, and maybe the league will recover, and maybe they'll figure out some things like a potential salary cap, and maybe that'll make things more competitive. But I do agree with you. It can kill a team's momentum as well. And that must have been difficult trying to recover from that after you lose all those guys, and they're also a year older. So even if you have them for an extra year, it kind of kills your plan, right? That 1 year plan, 3 year plan, 5 year plan, right? All of that's impacted when this happens, right?
sure. Yeah, I mean, it impacts the guys you have under contract. It impacts, what you were looking to spend in future years and where you were looking to spend it. Yeah, it impacts the whole thing. And for us, who we were one solid good year into probably what was 4 more years of that plan to get to the top,
Hmm.
and it impacted it.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's the unfortunate thing. But obviously, at the end of the day, I think there were some things with the MLB where they are right now. There were some things they do have to work out. So even though a lockout wouldn't be great, I do think there are some certain things they need to add, like that salary floor at the minimum is something that they're gonna have to work through. So even though the lockout will be bad in some regard of losing interest, right, and it'll hurt some teams' progress, I think in the long term look of it, the Dodgers, the way they've been kind of deferring money down the line and stuff like that, like those are things I think would help the game of baseball if there were limits on that. And after the NHL had that lockout in it was 2012, 2013, that was the, most recent one. How long do you think it took some teams? I know you just said Florida took you guys a couple years to try to, get back on track. Was that, similar for other teams, if you remember right from that, which I was young, so I'm trying to remember, but would you say there were other teams as well that struggled, after that time window?
Well, the teams, oh, sure. Yeah, there were definitely teams that struggled. I think that was the beginning of the end for dynasties like Detroit,
Hmm.
Chicago,
Chicago,
those
yeah.
types of clubs, right?
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean those were teams that were trending in the direction of trying to keep their clubs atop for as long as they could, and you lose that momentum with some veteran players that they had in those teams. All of a sudden, they're back to square one.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
That's
yeah,
the one thing. Mhm.
I don't recall too much about it. I couldn't speak specific about specific teams, but there were other teams that like Tampa that came out shot out of a cannon after that, and they were a top team for the next 10 years.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess it works out for some, and then others obviously it's difficult, especially if you're in a win now window, right? Losing that 1 year or a year, you're really trying to take that step up, right, from being a playoff team into that next upper echelon, and trying to make a run in the playoffs. When you lose that year, it does kill momentum. So that's the unfortunate thing when those things happen. It really does impact the direction of a team, the direction of certain players as well, the development and all that. It does hurt things, but. Anyways, Mike, I don't want to hold you too much longer. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today, to be part of the 400th episode. It truly was an honor to speak with you again, as it always is. And I wish you all the best with everything with the Hockey Intelligence Agency. I'm looking forward to when it is, ultimately released. I will definitely be marketing it for you and doing whatever I can to help out. I'm happy to help in any way possible. But thank you so much for your time, Mike. Truly.
Right on. Let's do this again. And I think your show is terrific because you're handling topics that people want to listen to,
Mhm.
uh, that aren't from traditional hockey podcasts or sports podcasts where you talk about games and scores and trades and funny stories. But you're really taking an angle that's from the business of the sport, and I think that there's a lot of people out there that really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you, Mike. Truly, it means a lot to hear that from you. And I know a lot of my episodes in the past, right? Most of them are, breaking down stories and trades. But I do think when I get guests on, people like you that have such an exceptional background, had so much success in the industry, it's important to hear their advice and hear about, what the insight is, when you're in the background and you're behind the scenes of the NHL draft, making trades. Like that's so much content that people won't hear, especially the general fan, right? We won't, read ever about that or hear about that unless we hear it from you. So, that's why having the opportunity to talk to you is an honor and to hear all of that exceptional insight. It really was, just awesome to have you today. So thank you so much, Mike, for joining me. And I look forward to having you on again. Anytime you want to be a guest, I would definitely always have you on anytime. So the next time, I'm sure there'll be some other things we'll talk about, but I'm looking forward to hearing an update on Hockey Intelligence Agency as well.
All right, right on. Thanks, Joey.
Thank you, Mike. Take care.